So today our distinguished seminar speaker is Dr. Ben Wherley in soil and crop science. And he's a turf science and ecology professor. He got his BS and MS from the Ohio State University. And today we're going to hear about a long-term research project over a few years on alternative landscapes and ecosystem services.
All right. Thanks, Amanda. All right. All right. Hopefully everybody can hear me all right. You guys do it right over here. I know we don't give bottles of wine to our seminar speakers, so thank Dr. Dingra for that. It's a pleasure to be here, and again, thank you for the invitation, Amanda. And I've been a professor in soil and crop science, been here since 2011. And I'm pretty good about attending our seminars. I can tell your faculty are about as good as I am. But I will tell you that, in some respects, I feel like my interests in research really align a lot more with horticulture than they do with some of the other faculty in our department. So I don't know much about breeding, even though I've sat through probably dozens and dozens of those seminars, but I'm still working on it. So as Amanda mentioned, today I'm going to be presenting on title here is Ecosystem Services of Urban Lawns and Landscapes. And this will highlight some of the research that we've been involved with at our research facility, which is out off F&B Road next to the Equine Center. So it's called the Scott's Miracle Grow Center for Lawn and Garden Research. And this relates in a large extent to urban water use. This might be a little bit outdated. This is from the Texas Water Development Board, 2012, but it gives a nice snapshot of where a lot of the water in Texas is used. And currently, more than 50%, at that time, 56% of the water that's used in the state is for irrigated agriculture. That does not include golf courses. That's strictly agriculture. And then about 27% is used here in municipal urban sectors. And if we were to look at this 27% and break it out, what we see is that the residential water use is about 2/3 of that. And then the other uses being anything from municipal to commercial to golf courses and educational. So it's a significant chunk. And the stats show that for residential, even though we don't have really solid numbers on the breakdown of what's being used in lawns versus indoors, it approaches 50% in a lot of the estimates, probably 40 to 50%, depending on how much you might water your lawn. Living here for 13 years, I would argue that a lot of that peak water that's used in the summer might actually be for showering. I take about 3 showers a day in the summer because I get so sweaty. Now, looking ahead 50 years, I guess they pay people the big bucks to come up with these stats. I don't know how they came up with them, but they project that in 2070, the irrigation that I showed you earlier that was above 50% will likely be in the mid-30s. You can see municipal here. And that's in response to a population that's becoming much more urbanized and greater demands for water we're going to see at that time. So this research really came about through trends that we were seeing that involved, let me back up. Some of the trends we're seeing in landscapes over the last 10 to 20 years, as we all are well familiar with, are what we would call mandated water restrictions. This could be coming from a city that's telling you can only water your lawn, say, 1 day a week, or in the case of severe stages, maybe once every 2 weeks. Or this may be coming from a water purveyor, such as the San Antonio water system. If you've ever been to Saws, anybody ever been to Saws? Okay, when you walk in there, it's like walking into a federal building. You walk through a metal detector as you go in the building. they have a lot of power. But they can tell you what to plant in your lawn, and they can tell you how much you're able to water your lawn. And to a greater extent, we're seeing these water restrictions imposed in urban areas. In the Carolinas, where I did my doctorate work, what we saw was we didn't see incentivization of removing lawns per se, but what we saw was cities encouraging homeowners to switch from cool season to warm season lawns. So tall fescue was a major lawn grass there in that region in the Carolinas. And what you're seeing now is a conversion to Bermudas and zoysia grasses. I think in Raleigh in 2008 during that drought, they were paying homeowners around $500 to do that. We're also seeing increased interest in drip irrigation. I don't do a lot of research in drip, but to some extent, we're seeing more of that, maybe in lawn situations. Increased recycled water use. This is more probably on the professional side, golf courses, parks, sports fields. But once again, in North Carolina, there was a city, the city of Cary, and it was a kind of a newer community, and they've actually plumbed effluent water into the neighborhoods. So every home actually has potable water and effluent water potable for drinking, effluent for the landscape. Interesting story about that. There was an article when I lived there about someone in Cary that they literally had their pipes crossed, and they were drinking effluent water for about 5 months. Never realized it until someone came in to work on their plumbing. So it tells you the extent that they actually clean that up too. So it's very similar to potable with allowance for a little more fecal coliform bacteria, but thankfully they were okay. Weather-based smart irrigation controllers, we're seeing these. If you go into any box store now, you see these all over the shelves. Some of these don't even have buttons or dials. It's basically, you have to have a cell phone to use it. And so Braccio is a big leader in that area. We've done a little work with these, and interestingly, these don't necessarily save water. They're all about being smart. We found that they provide more water than that grass actually needs. And then this last one here, conversion to water efficient landscapes. This is what this project relates to. If you look across some of the major cities here, you'll see language that relates to this. SAWS is an example that has an approved turf list for one, and also from time to time has a lawn removal coupon program. Now I've noticed that these seem to come and go depending on maybe the stage of drought. Austin, same way here. What you're seeing in Austin is a lot of not only removal rebates, but also restrictions on how much irrigated turf you can have in a landscape. And that's been a kind of a political issue in the last year or so. San Marcos, Georgetown, I could name a number of these, but it's a growing trend in Texas. It's a growing trend across the Southwest. We talked to our colleagues in the kind of the Southeast, Georgia, Mississippi, Florida. Florida sees a little bit of this, but by and large, it's more of a central, southwest phenomenon. This is Austin's program. This is from a few years ago, but the incentive is to remove the grass. They'll pay you $35 for every 100 square feet that's converted, and up to 5,000 square feet. Okay, and then what you need to convert this to, can't use artificial turf in most of these. It has to be a combination of some other types of materials. And they typically, a lot of these have 50% plant requirement on a given area. I was reading an article out of California because this was a big deal in California. And about 10 years ago, the IRS started wanting to tax people for these rebates because some of these homeowners were making $10,000 to convert their lawns over to alternative plant species. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon. And so our interest in this was just simply from the standpoint of if we undergo a lawn removal and replace that with water-saving plant materials, that's a good thing in terms of saving water, no doubt. But in a climate like ours, what are some of the other ecosystem services that these landscapes will provide over time? And this is a very catchy buzzword right now. And so I looked up the definition because I wasn't sure myself. And it says that the ecosystem services are defined as the direct and indirect benefits that ecosystems provide humans. And this comes in 4 forms: provisioning services, regulating services, supporting services, and cultural services. If we think about lawns or ornamentals, for example, these would likely fall into these regulating services, okay, as well as these cultural services. There's no doubt a kind of a social health component to landscapes and various types and the effect plants have on social health. But also these environmental concerns. So this is what I'll focus on in this presentation in relation to some of the dynamics that are at play when we start to make these conversions. So urban runoff will be a big focus of this because this study was conducted on our urban runoff facility, which is located out here at our research facility. Why is urban runoff a problem? Again, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but in case you're not aware, urban runoff is a problem because it results in loss of compounds into our surface waters. These might be pesticides, these might be fertilizer nutrients, these might be dissolved organic nitrogen, dissolved organic carbon, heavy metals, animal feces. That's a big one. I think I read a stat that if you add up the amount of nitrogen that a dog produces, a large dog like I have, it comes out to more than 2 to 3 pounds of nitrogen a year per 1,000 square feet. So it's a substantial amount of excrement and associated nitrogen and phosphorus with that certainly has an impact. And then some other compounds here, as you see. Okay, so I've mentioned this urban runoff facility. This was constructed in 2012. Dr. Richard White, who was my predecessor, and Dr. Kevin McInnes, who is a soil physicist in our department, both had the early vision for this facility. When I started in 2011, I was fortunate enough to inherit it and get to have fun doing research on it. So I have to give them credit for all the hard work they put in on this. Just a little background on this. This has 24 individually irrigated plots. They were originally sodded to Raleigh St. Augustine grass. These are built on a 3.5% slope. So this backside is the uphill, the bottom side is the downhill. You can see a collection gutter at each plot that flows into a flume and an auto sampler. So we can monitor runoff volumes, we can monitor runoff dynamics, and we can also measure constituents of that runoff. Scott's Miracle-Gro actually funded this when these were put in. I think these were each close to $10,000. They put 24 of these in, so it was a pretty substantial commitment from Scott's. And so this is Dr. Baoxing Chang. Bob is a former postdoc and PhD student of mine. He's currently the director of the Thomas Turfgrass Services out here on Highway 30 in Bryan, which is a soil physical testing lab. He did a lot of this research that I'll be presenting today. So as I mentioned, these plots were originally all sodded to St. Augustine grass in 2012, and we conducted a number of studies evaluating nutrient runoff and effects of wetting agents and so on and so forth. But in 2017, we decided, hey, let's go ahead and let's put alternative landscapes into some of these plots. And let's look at what the impacts of this will be over the course of, well, these studies are still ongoing. So again, in 2017, we took 16 of those plots and we essentially took a sod cutter and we stripped them out. So we took them down, and I'll show you in a minute here, but took them down anywhere from 2 to 4 inches, removed that material, and came back in with some different types of materials that would be similar to what a homeowner might do if they were to remove their lawn and replace it with an alternative landscape. And so for the next 17 months, we collected a number of data, which I'll share with you here in a minute. This is just an aerial view. So right here you have F&B Road along the southern end here, Aggie South. This is the Equine Road here. This is our facility. This is our road going back to our research facility. And this is the runoff facility. So one of the ideas when they built this was that they didn't want to disturb the soil. They wanted to maintain the original soil structure that was there. So they built this into the existing hillside, into a slope that was pretty close to what it is now, which is 3.5%. Put a big French drain behind it with bull rock, intercept any incoming surface water and divert it. And then you can see the plots here. So I'll show you what these are here in just a minute as we move through the talk here. So we tried to simulate as much as we could what a homeowner might do in this renovation process. And so what you can see here is some of the landscape treatments going in. This, for example, is our what we called our xeriscaping. And we had effectively removed around 4 inches of topsoil from these plots. We removed the sod and then another 3 to 3.5 inches of soil. And this was all completely removed and taken off site. Came back in with decomposed granite, built this up about 4 inches, compacted these with a tamper. And then we left pockets in here which occupied 50% of that plot for our plantings. So we were trying to mimic what the recommendation was, is 50% plants in that landscape. These liners were pulled out. These were just there temporarily so we didn't get our materials crossed. We installed drip irrigation in these water efficient landscapes. And at the end of the day, we had these 5 treatments. So again, this is our original lawn plots, which we didn't disturb. We didn't change in any way. These had been there since 2012. Here was a treatment called sand cap lawn. And this was essentially stripping out the sod, putting in I believe it was a 4-inch layer of construction sand, kind of a well-graded construction sand, that very cheap material we were able to get from Knife River. And then we brought in wash sod to lay on top of that. And this is a practice that's used a lot on golf courses. For instance, the campus course, they sand capped all of their fairways. Veterans Park, if you played soccer over there, they've sand capped all of those fields. And it's a means of dealing with our high sodium in our water. So it allows that turf to have a root zone there in that sand that won't degrade over time due to the sodium. And so that was our interest. We don't see that a lot in home lawns, and we wanted to test the effects of sand capping on some of these measurables. So we had a St. Augustine lawn, sand cap lawn, which again was St. Augustine grass, the xeriscaping, which I just showed you here in the last slide. And so these little pockets, they had about 3 to 4 inches of topsoil that these plants were planted into. And then we brought in a 1-inch layer of this decomposed granite over top, just to kind of smooth everything out. So these plots had 50% plantings. And then we had a mulch plot that was very similar, except that we took the sod out, we took it down to 2 inches and brought in 2 inches of mulch. Might be a little excessive, but the plan was to, okay, what happens with when you bring mulch in? And then finally, we installed artificial turf. Don't see a lot of this in College Station, but if you'll see quite a bit of it in Texas and in California and Florida. It's becoming quite popular. This is just a synthetic turf that didn't have We don't put crumb rubber in this like they would on a sports field, but what we do top dress it with was a green sand. So there's no crumb rubber in that, but just simply a green sand that's top dressed into those fibers. And so for our plants and our xeriscape and our mulch plots, we consulted with SSC. We also looked at the Texas Native Plant Selection Guide. We came up with a kind of a palette of plantings that involved yucca, Texas sage, muley grass, and I knew I'd forget. There's one other, but it's probably not that important right now. But these were recommended kind of adapted ornamental plants for this region. The data that we collected over the next 17 months included runoff dynamics, flow rates and volumes from naturally occurring rain events. So we didn't irrigate to induce any of these runoff events. These were all natural events. Now, I will mention that the grass was irrigated about a ½ an inch twice a week, like we would for a lawn, but that never generated runoff. Okay, so that's important to note. We looked at nutrient contents in these runoff samples. So we would collect from those auto samplers. We would combine those samples and simply multiply the average concentration in those bottles by the total flow coming off of those plots to calculate our exports. And we were looking at particularly nitrogen and phosphorus. We also measured temperature. So in this way, we would go out in the early afternoon with just simply IR temperature gun. We also took some FLIR images to document comparative temperatures on these plots, and then just monitored weed pressure. We managed those turf plots like you would a standard home lawn. So we did use pre-emergence herbicides in the spring. We also put them out in the fall. We did not put pre-emergence herbicides on our synthetic turf, but we did put them on the xeriscape and the mulch. So the synthetic turf was the only treatments that did not get the pre-emergence herbicides. So jumping into the data here, this is a graph that shows over the course of that period from September of 2018 all the way through September of 2019. This is kind of that first 13 months. And I think I put the wrong year. Actually, we installed these plots in August of 2018. I think I might have said 2017. The blue in the background represents rainfall amounts. And I know for you grad students, this probably isn't the appropriate way to graph this because for me, it was that you were able to see this a little better in relation to these runoff volumes. So the bars represent the runoff volumes from the treatments, and those peaks represent the rainfall amounts that generated those runoff volumes. So for perspective, the highest rainfall during that 13 months was about a 220 millimeter event that occurred over a couple-day period in October of 2018. That's equivalent to, if my math's right, somewhere around 8 inches. And then you can see some much smaller events that were probably in the range of around an inch, okay, that generated runoff. I'll jump into some of the data on this, but I will also show you some kind of pooled averages that help you make a little more sense of this as we move on. So, but what we did see was that there was an effect of landscape type and also rainfall amount on runoff volumes. And again, we'll kind of jump in a little more detail into these. One of the more interesting things that we observed in this study was the temporal dynamics of runoff in relation to rainfall. And these graphs show our 5 treatments here: artificial turf, xeriscaping mulch, sandcap lawn, and St. Augustine grass lawn. This is from October 10th, 2018. And what this is showing is 2-minute intervals, okay? And the dotted light blue lines are actually the rainfall intensity. The red line is actually showing our flow rate, our runoff flow. And this is interesting because what it shows you is the nature the response of these plots to rainfall. And the one I will kind of point out here to start is xeriscaping. Okay, and one of the things with xeriscaping we notice is it very much mimicked the rainfall pattern. So if we'd see a little peak in rainfall, immediately there was runoff. If it dropped, you'd see runoff drop. So it very much mirrored the rainfall patterns, which is not surprising because xeriscaping has a base that's a compacted decomposed granite that has a decent amount of silt and clay and fines to kind of plug up those macropores. So you'd see a decent amount of runoff that was very proportional to rainfall here. With very little, this outer section to the right is showing what we see after the rain ends. And you don't see much coming off of these plots at that point. Now, I'll take you to the other extreme here, and we look at the sand cap lawn. Okay, and first I'll say the artificial turf was very similar to the xeriscape. And it's probably because it was also based with decomposed granite. The sand cap lawn actually was able to capture a lot of that rainfall. And it did not even produce any runoff until a few hours into that event here. When it did, you can notice its peak runoff flow was a lot lower than that of decomposed granite-based system. So in this case, the xeriscaping was flowing off at 1.4 liters per second. You can see our sand cap lawn, the peak flow that it achieved was about 0.3 liters per second. So that was really encouraging to look at the effect of putting a sand layer on top of our native soil for capturing rainfall and mitigating stormwater flows from a flash flood event, if you will. Now, mulch also did a really good job of not responding and not giving up that water during the rainfall event. And you can see here its peak flow is about 0.2 liters per second. So again, both the sand capped and the mulch did a really nice job of kind of assimilating that rainfall and not resulting in runoff. Now, the lawn, it actually produced some pretty high runoff volumes here. You can see this was a pretty substantial rainfall, but you can see here that it approached about 0.9 liters per second, not quite as high as that xeriscaping, but likely that soil was saturated and that water was being generated to runoff. So if we break down our events, the greater than 50 millimeters, so this would be greater than 2-inch rainfall events. This is a 1 to 2 inch rainfall event. This would be about a 0 to 1 inch rainfall event. What's interesting with these treatments is we see that they're having effects on the generation of runoff at these lower amounts. But as we get up beyond 2 inches, an event of 2 inches, there's really little difference between these treatments. So, we'll hear people suggest that, well, we could put in this type of a landscape and we could prevent another Hurricane Harvey. Well, that's not going to happen because this is saying anything over 2 inches, and it's pretty much like, not a whole lot of difference. We see some trends here, but there was a lot of variability here. And as you get up beyond that 2 inches, that these landscapes just have much less effect on sequestering that water. But what we do see, when you look at this, you see that the least runoff, again, was associated with the sand cap lawn, the St. Augustine lawn, and the mulch. Okay, the highest runoff, once again, is with our xeriscaping and our artificial turf. So these decomposed granite-based systems because of their infiltration rates. We also did a regression with rainfall on the x-axis and runoff on the y-axis using these data. And we're able to show that kind of that threshold of rainfall that would be needed for each of these systems to generate runoff. And similar to that last slide, what we showed is that it would really only require about 10.2 millimeters of rainfall, so literally 0.4 of an inch, before we would expect to see runoff in these decomposed granite systems in artificial turf. But as we move to the sand cap lawn, that system can capture nearly an inch of water before we see any runoff. So that was an interesting observation. Then St. Augustine grass and mulch kind of fell intermediate to those at about 16 and 18 millimeters. So this gives us an idea how much these systems can handle before they'll begin to shed water. And obviously, every soil is going to be a little different. And this was our unique set of plots and constructed soils that we designed for this study. So that looks a little bit at the dynamics of the runoff and the runoff volumes that we saw from these natural rainfall events. And now I want to jump into the chemistry of those runoff samples. This is just a kind of a simplified ANOVA. The point being, you can see a lot of asterisks here, asterisks. The point being that these treatments definitely, we see a definite not only landscape, but date by landscape interactions on nutrients. And again, I'll get into the nitrogen and phosphorus runoff here. Before I do that though, this is actually suspended solids. So what we would do is we would actually filter these samples when we bring them into the lab, and we could actually determine the amount of suspended solids that were coming off of these plots. If you look at October 2018, this is only about a month and a half into the project. So these plots are pretty new. And you can see that's when we see the peak in sediment loss from these plots, and the most of which is occurring from, this is our xeriscaping, okay? So most of which is occurring from the decomposed granite-based plots and probably some of the silts and clays, which is probably exacerbated by the high sodium in our water, okay, is leading to a lot of that loss. Over time, those begin to stabilize, and we see much less suspended solids loss from the system, and to the point where they're still shedding a little bit more than the other treatments, but only on specific dates, and much of the differences are non-significant. This is phosphate, and I will say that for phosphorus losses, who knows what the old turf facility was 20 years ago out there beside the equine complex? There is some cotton there now, but it was a dairy facility. One of the classes we teach called a green a couple of years ago, when we started to excavate that soil, it literally smelled like you were scooping up manure. You could still smell it in that soil after 20 years. These soils are rich in phosphorus. The other thing I learned, I did a soil test before we put our irrigation on it. Does anyone know what our native topsoil pH is here before you throw irrigation water on it? It was about, the sample I took was about 4.9. And so they tend to run neutral to probably slightly acidic, but it only takes a couple months of our water to drive it up into the 8s and 9s. Now, I only say the background of this facility because you're going to see higher phosphorus levels than you might expect in some of these treatments. And one, for example, the highest levels we were seeing were actually in the mulch and in the St. Augustine grass lawn. So phosphate levels were the highest in those treatments, and they seem to peak in the fall. They seem to peak in the fall, and to be quite honest, it may, I'm not sure why that is. I probably have to dig back into the data. But for St. Augustine lawn, another caveat to this, we've done studies where we've had historically unfertilized, we have plots out here that have never received fertilizer. And when you compare their phosphorus losses to those that are fertilized, they're virtually the same. And so that tells us that a lot of that phosphorus most of the phosphorus we're seeing is just coming from legacy phosphorus in the system. Now, what's interesting is when we sand cap that turf, we put that sand layer under that wash sod, we had some of the lowest levels of phosphorus. Okay, actually it was a little bit intermediate, but it was actually much lower than our kind of turf that had been there from the start of the project. So that suggests that something about the sand, and we think it may be something to do with the chemistry of that sand, might be tying up some of that phosphorus and keeping it from being lost to runoff. Dissolved organic carbon. I know this was a big interest of Dr. Aikenhead Peterson, who's now retired. But we looked at dissolved organic carbon because it has a big influence on bacterial populations and surface waters. We saw the highest population or the highest DOC coming from the mulch, as you might expect. It's ground up decomposing wood fiber. And we also saw moderate amounts of DOC coming from the St. Augustine grass lawns, which I would suspect is mostly attributable to the clipping return. We're mowing these plots every week, returning clippings, and they're always there when you catch a rainfall event, get some of that solubilized carbon and nitrogen leaving the system. Now this is our looking into some of our nitrogen data. And this is, of course, nitrogen and phosphorus being probably what we're most interested in from a eutrophication standpoint. When we look at nitrate, something that was very surprising to us, and I don't know if you can see it here, when you look at this graph, which one of these kind of strikes you as being odd? Artificial turf. It's showing nearly the highest levels of nitrate of those plots. It's very similar to St. Augustine grass lawn. We are not fertilizing this. In this, we continued this work for about 6 more months, and the differences got even greater. And I'll show you the graph here in a minute. This was very puzzling. I asked my postdoc, I said, did you fertilize those? No, I didn't fertilize those. Why would I fertilize artificial turf, right? Okay. Well, so it turns out if you add up the amount of atmospheric nitrogen that could be deposited over the course of a year, it adds up to almost a pound of nitrogen per year. It's about 3/4 of a pound. And that's in the ballpark of what we're seeing here. So we think this is either coming from atmospheric deposition of nitrogen into a system that has no ability to assimilate it, or we also think it could be coming from mineralization of the soil organic matter after we took out the turf. And that nitrogen, that's the nitrate that's being generated through mineralization having nowhere to go, somehow working its way down to that retaining wall and kind of moving up over into our flume. Dr. McInnes is a big believer that it's atmospheric deposition. I was always of the belief that it might be more from that mineralization. We don't know, but we think it's one of those two that explains that. I will say our nitrate N levels never exceeded the EPA drinking water. When I look back at the data today, average nitrate concentrations coming off of our turf plots was in the 1 to 3 parts per million range. And none of these plots exceeded, there might have been a few cases where these got up to 5 parts per million, but it was very rare. So most of these were well into that 1 to 3 parts per million range. Total dissolved nitrogen. So again, this is adding up our nitrate, ammonium, and dissolved organic nitrogen. You can see here, if you look at the total dissolved nitrogen coming off of these plots, it's highest in the St. Augustine grass lawn. Again, we're not exceeding any thresholds that are concerning, but we are fertilizing these. We're returning clippings. When you get a heavy rainfall, it's likely that you're going to shed some of that dissolved organic nitrogen. Mulch was also showing decent amounts of dissolved organic nitrogen leaving those plots, interestingly. So at the end of this study, we did publish this. And this is just a little snippet from that publication. After the 13 months, you can see nitrate, this is the total export. The units here are milligrams per meter squared. It was highest in artificial turf, believe it or not, nitrate was, followed by St. Augustine grass lawn, xeriscaping, and then our lowest two were the mulch and sand cap. You can see some of these other values here. If we look at total dissolved nitrogen, of course, it's again highest in the mulch and St. Augustine grass, lowest in the sand cap and the xeriscaping. So some potential benefit from that idea of sand capping in terms of maybe helping with water quality that leaves our managed landscapes. Surface temperatures maybe wasn't surprising to me, but it was surprising to our students who were taking the data. This is actually the top two values that you see on these temperatures. These were taken again, kind of early to middle part of the day, in the peak heat of the day. In the summer, these artificial turf plots and the mulch plots would approach 160 Fahrenheit, 70 Celsius. And again, that was mostly in the summertime. Natural grass systems like St. Augustine grass and sand-capped were able to keep those temperatures a little closer to ambient. They're always a little warmer than ambient air temperature, but able to moderate that heat in the summertime. So this is certainly an obvious consideration that people, communities should take into account if we're concerned about warming temperatures in urban environments. If you've had any kids that have played soccer on synthetic turf fields, you know what I'm talking about. You just kind of groan when you hear that the game's going to be on synthetic turf at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And so this is kind of what we saw in terms of those surface temperatures. And so again, not a big surprise. We kind of know this is the case, but it was kind of nice to document that. Weed pressure. Weed pressure was something we wanted to characterize just simply from give some information to folks that if you're going to do this in a climate that gets 42 inches of rain a year, here's what to expect. Interestingly, when we've gone to California and had meetings, I like to drive around and take pictures of landscapes. And it's funny, the landscapes I see the most people working in are kind of these xeriscapes, these alternative landscapes. I always see people pulling weeds. Don't see a lot of people on the lawns. But again, I'm not suggesting, I wouldn't recommend lawns in a climate where you have less than 10 to 15 inches of rain a year either. So I think these systems have their place, but you can see here that we were constantly battling weeds in these xeriscape plots in College Station. So this is Bermuda grass. We had annual bluegrass, we had spurge, and we would constantly every week go out, take weed counts, spray those weeds, and then come back the next week, take more weed counts, spray those weeds in order to assess, what that weed pressure was. This is synthetic turf. You can see the spurge coming up in here. Right now, if you go out there, we've got quite a bit of weeds coming up in that synthetic turf. Again, there's a sand infill. So any of that weed seed that blows into that system germinates and comes on up. So these systems are not zero maintenance. So Dr. Chong quantified this. You can see here, this is showing weed counts throughout the season. And this is our xeriscaping. That was a challenge, right? So we just get too much, I think we get too much rainfall here to start to recommend these kind of systems, maybe in smaller areas, but it's going to be a battle with managing weeds in those systems. Plot aesthetics. I like this. I didn't tell my student to do this, but he took plot aesthetics. We do turf quality ratings in our work, and it's a kind of an odd 1 to 9 scale. We use a 1 to 9 scale, 6 being minimally acceptable, and nobody ever gives a 9. So what does that leave you with? Well, if the grass looks okay, you're probably going to give it a 7 or an 8. Okay, so I changed that and I use a 5 to 9, and I'll give 9s, right? So I want to have a little statistical capability to move some data and make some differences. Well, Bob gave the artificial turf. He gave it 9, 9, 9, 9, 9 every single month, which rightly so. It looks good throughout the year, right? Sandcap lawn, St. Augustine grass lawns, okay, they're achieving somewhere between a 6 and an 8 in the growing season, and they quickly drop off in the fall through early spring. This time of year, we're seeing large patch in those lawns. We're seeing grassy weeds. In my lawns, no different. The quality of those lawns can drop substantially. The xeriscaping and mulch were somewhat intermediate throughout the course of that study. So I thought it was interesting to kind of quantify the quality over the course of the year. If we look at the total water usage, We could have kind of predicted this from the beginning because we had set amounts of water we were putting on these plots. The plants in the xeriscaping and mulch were kind of on a per plant basis from some recommendations we found. Sand cap lawns and our lawn plots were based on reference ET, so historical monthly reference ET, so which is about an inch a month in the summer. Looking back at this, and I was trying to figure out why we put more on the St. Augustine grass lawn than the sand cap. I think this might be that Bob actually we have water flow meters on our plots. And I think he actually recorded what those flow meters were showing. So it turns out that we actually put a little less on our sand cap lawn, but it wasn't statistically different. And of course, our artificial turf was not irrigated. Just some other things to consider in terms of landscapes is aesthetics, maintenance and cost, potential allergens. And then in summary, based on what we're seeing with these studies, I find it pretty interesting. Xeriscaping and water efficient landscapes certainly reduce irrigation. However, what we're seeing with these is there's higher runoff and potential, and extra cost and maintenance may be needed, certainly in our climate. And rainfall, annual rainfall is probably going to dictate that. Artificial turf has many advantages, year-round green color, low maintenance, but there is high surface temperature that could make it a poor choice in warm areas. The initial construction cost is pretty high. And I'll mention here that we did not have, as I mentioned, crumb rubber infill in our plots. And you can imagine that's probably going to absorb a lot more of that solar radiation than what we had as a kind of a green sand. So I would expect, had we used a crumb rubber, those temperatures probably would have driven up even more. So just interesting to note. Another interesting thing here is the idea of a sand cap lawn. This is not something that's been commonly practiced, but certainly for areas that maybe have flash floods or deal with poor water quality like we do, I believe this is something that should be considered, whether that's a pretty shallow sand cap that might be 2 inches or something all the way up to more of a deeper cap for higher rainfall areas. Incidentally, SSC, who's our landscapers on campus, they build into their specs now, any new sod that goes out on campus, they will sand cap. They have kind of a mix that they've come up with. They'll sand cap that and try to put a sand-based sod on there. So Aggie Park's an example of that, and it seemed to be pretty successful in preventing that kind of sod, die, repeat that we see so often on campus. So our hope with this is that we can start to develop a body of research that we can share with municipalities, water purveyors, HOAs, just to make them aware of some of the other impacts and considerations that should go into recommending these different landscapes. Water savings is a great thing, but we need to also take into account other other aspects of these conversions. Right now, these plots are still in place, but we've kind of shifted. We're actually looking at runoff and leachate losses in these plots from spot treatment applications of glyphosate and atrazine. And so we've been doing this project now since last summer, and seeing some kind of interesting results. Our hypothesis being that maybe turf would actually assimilate a lot more of that herbicide, tie it up, and some of these other more like our xeriscape plots with less organic matter, maybe we see more of this herbicide leaving those plots. The results have been a little bit counterintuitive. What we've noticed is spraying glyphosate on turf, we're actually seeing a little bit higher losses from that turf than we are from these other systems. And that it could be that there's a difference between having herbicide on the leaf surface and getting rainfall within a day or two, and actually having it in the soil where it's bound up to that organic carbon. So this is something that's interesting to us. We'll continue to kind of dig into this a bit. You might ask why glyphosate on a lawn unless you're making a mistake. Well, there's a Provista St. Augustine grass that was just released by Scott's company that has a glyphosate tolerance gene. And so homeowners are now spraying glyphosate on their lawns, if you can believe that. So that's kind of where this is going at the moment. And I wanted to just highlight a few of the publications that we've been able to generate from this project. One of them deals with kind of the runoff volume dynamics. One deals with the water quality, and another deals with some of the energy balance and temperature dynamics in these systems. So feel free to take a look at those if you're wanting to dig into this a little further. So with that, I'll just say if you ever want to stop out and say hello and visit our facility, open invitation. We'd love to have you visit. I want to acknowledge some of our key collaborators on this work. Again, Dr. Bob Chong, who's directing the Thomas Turf Services out here in Bryan, Dr. Kevin McInnes, our soil physicist, Dr. Richard White, and Dr. Jackie Aikenhead Peterson. With that, the funding for this has come from the Lawn Institute, Texas Water Resources Institute, and Scott's Miracle-Gro Company, as well as the Tree Endowment, our Texas Turfgrass Research Education Extension Endowment. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions or comments or thoughts.
Hey, Ben, this is Charlie Hall. I'm online. I'm not there in the room, but I got a quick question for you.
Yes.
First of all, excellent job. I love hearing about ecosystem services of turf. Turf gets, it's kind of the stepchild of the landscape in terms of the blame that it gets a lot of times. One of the ecosystem services that you didn't mention, though, was carbon sequestration. Have y'all done any work on carbon sequestration, or was the work that Ohio State did back in the 2010, 11, and 12? Is that work pretty much what everybody accepts as the gospel in terms of the well-managed turfgrass lawn sequesters more carbon than what's generated from the maintenance, the mow, blow, and going of a turfgrass lawn? So have we done anything down in the Southwest on carbon sequestration?
Well, thanks for your question and thanks for your comments, Dr. Hall. We personally have not looked at carbon sequestration. Now, we have measured gaseous losses from these plots, and it's really hard to glean what the net effect on carbon sequestration is from kind of temporal point in time measurements of those type. And I think in terms of what the overall what we're seeing in other universities and where research is being done in that regard, NC State's done a little bit of that, and it's, I'm kind of drawing a blank, but I think the big picture is showing that it really comes down to the maintenance intensity of that system. And as you suggested, I think a lot of high-end golf courses are going to tend to have a little bit more of a more of a net positive. So they're probably not they're not capturing as much carbon as they're using, and probably lower input systems tend to have a net negative carbon effect. So they tend to be probably assimilating more carbon than they're actually using. So at the end of the day, it's probably close to net neutral, I think, when you look across the board at turf systems. And I think it really does come down to the intensity and the amounts of fertilizer and mowing that are going into those systems and water.
Yeah. In some cases in Ohio State research, they were noticing that up to 80%, I think, if I'm remembering off the top of my head correctly, of the carbon sequestered from the landscape in residential landscapes was from the turf, and the other part was the shrubs and the trees. So I think as an industry, when we start getting battered over the head regarding the carbon footprint of our landscapes, is we need to look at the landscape systems and not pit trees versus turf and so forth, but we look at the combined effect of our urban landscapes.
That's a great point. Dr. Casey Reynolds, who some of you probably know, he was our extension specialist here. Now he's the director of the Turf Producers International, and he's launched a big marketing campaign and put out a lot of surveys to decision makers who aren't really affiliated with turf or landscaping to see what resonates with them. And interestingly, carbon sequestration doesn't resonate as much with them as oxygen production. So what they found was that focusing on oxygen production in these landscapes is really what seems to resonate with folks that aren't closely affiliated to what we do. And so I think and I could be butchering it, but I want to say he said a typical lawn can produce enough oxygen for a family of 4, maybe a front lawn even. So that's kind of the way he's starting to approach it as well. And so no, those are some great questions and great points. We'd like to get a little more involved in that. And I know Julie Howe is starting to do quite a bit of this in agriculture. And so hopefully we can piggyback onto some of this at some point and start to make some headway. Any other questions?
Can I ask one more? Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Go
sure,
ahead. I
sure.
see somebody in the room
Just-
there. Go
it's-
ahead.
Yeah,
I
it's
don't
just
want.
Dr. Bergner. He'll hold up.
Well, Davy Tree has software for actually putting a dollar value on the ecosystem services that trees provide and shrubs. And there are some other systems that are available that allow you to do that on the shrub and tree side. Are there any software packages that allow you to put an actual dollar figure or estimate a dollar figure for some of these turfgrass ecosystem services? I've not run across one, but that doesn't mean there's not one.
I haven't, but that's something Dr. Baltensberger's kind of been pushing us on, because with this growing interest in carbon credits,
Yeah.
there's quite a bit of turf in Texas, and that could help contribute to that. So I'll have to look into that. That's another great question that I honestly don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, thank you. You said that was iTree? iTree. I'll make a note of that. We never measured bulk density of these materials. I do know that the sand capping sand, it's got a porosity of about 33%. So you could probably start to figure out bulk density from that. And then I know that let's see, the decomposed granite, not sure, I haven't looked at the bulk density on it. But again, it was a very heavily compacted, took a tamper in there and tamped it as we were laying it in there, similar to what a homeowner might do in that situation. So I'd have to look back and see we don't have the data on that. No, we did not measure that, those samples. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Thank you.
And we do have a little reception outside.